Hi, everybody, and welcome to Exegetically Speaking, a podcast of the friends and faculty of Wheaton College, Wheaton, Illinois, and the Lanier Theological Library in Houston, Texas. My name is David Capes, and I am the Senior Research Fellow at the Lanier Theological Library and a former dean up there in Wheaton at the School of Biblical and Theological Studies. Our purpose in these podcasts is really very simple. We want to promote the study of biblical languages, Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, so we can read the Bible more faithfully, study it more fully, and not just read it, but to live it. Joining me today on Exegetically Speaking is Doug Hoffer, who is an undergrad at Wheaton College and an alum there of their MABE program, Master of Arts in Biblical Exegesis. He's now in the final stages of doing his PhD in Jewish and Christian Bible at the University of Chicago. Doug, thanks for being with us on Exegetically Speaking.
Hey, thank you so much, Dr. Capes. This is a real treat and privilege.
Well, I know you've been listening to the podcast, and you got to get a sense of what we're up to here on this. But let's begin with our sort of signature question. How did you get started reading biblical languages?
Sure. So I started reading Greek when I first entered the undergrad program at Wheaton College. I was a pretty bad Greek student initially, mostly because I was a boy raised on charismatic revivalism and dispensational eschatology. And so I had a lot of love for scripture, but very little appreciation for those ivory tower individuals. So, the idea was you can learn whatever you need to learn just from all the good translations and comparing them. And so I came into Wheaton hoping to be a pastor in that same sort of line and stream of thought. But around the third semester, I really started to appreciate the nuance, the depth, the clarity that study of the biblical languages gave to my reading of scripture.
And it was after a course with Dr. Gene Green, right, on the Petrine letters and Book of Jude.
That did it. I was hooked. At that point, it was like, wow, there are so many things that I could never possibly get just from reading a translation. It just took things to another level and just broadened and deepened my understanding and appreciation for scripture. So I went on to do the master's at Wheaton in Biblical Exegesis, and then another master's at the University of Chicago, where I went from Koine to classical Greek and Latin and studied more Hebrew. And it just sort of opened up antiquity. It just made it possible to read all these different authors and philosophers and moral theorists and sort of see how there's so many unique things that the New Testament authors are doing in this context. And they're both clarified by, but they also sort of illuminate how unique Christianity is at the time, even as it's still so fundamentally part of that culture.
That Jewish world, right? The Jewish world of the time. And one of the things we're going to talk about today is John 16 and how sort of Jesus comes into a Jewish world speaking in very odd and, for some people, confusing ways.
Yeah.
And that is highlighted in what you and I are going to talk about today. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I think one of the most distinguishing characteristics of the Gospel of John is that John really portrays Jesus' speech consistently as a kind of web of metaphors and double entendres. There's tons and tons of wordplay throughout the Gospel. And it's sometimes puzzling and challenging for us as readers, but it's even more so for the audiences. And so you have this pattern of misunderstanding consistently throughout the Gospel, where Jesus says something that is intended to be taken metaphorically, such as eat my flesh and drink my blood, right, in John 6.
John 6, yeah.
And his audience immediately goes to the literal and physical interpretation of that, and they say, well, I don't know how you can do that. How can we eat your flesh? Cannibalism, the ingestion of blood, God's not really cool with that. So what are you asking for here? And it even alienates some of his disciples. So the audiences in these narratives are themselves really surprised by Jesus' speech, and they find him very, very puzzling. And that issue, the fact that this kind of tension between how the reader experiences this text as someone with, as you said before, like 2,000 years of Christian history behind them, the interpretation of this text for so long, certain things make sense to you as a reader. But to the audience in the pre-resurrection era,
right,
where they don't know about a Eucharist, they're not understanding the reception of the Spirit at baptism, right? John 3. These are things that are extremely puzzling. And so what's interesting is that Christians have traditionally throughout the last 2,000 years often used the portrayal of the Jewish people in John as misunderstanding, confusion, etc., as an argument against them as God's people, as being precious to God, and sort of used for a lot of supersessionism.
Yeah, I can remember people, talk about Jews being willingly blind,
Right.
and having a veil over their heads, and,
Mm-hmm.
and until they turn to Jesus, none of this will make sense to them, kind of thing. And it just presents them in a very kind of negative way. But what Jesus is saying at that moment is not all that clear all the time, right? If it's maybe clear for us who've been doing this for 30, 40 years in our life, but it's not clear to people who are hearing it for the very first time in Galilee.
Right. So I think it's important, in order to kind of push back against this Christian anti-Judaism, to sort of see how, even in the gospel, Jesus himself presents his speech as being confusing, as being enigmatic. And so the perfect example of this is John 16:25. Jesus is with his disciples. This is the farewell discourse. And he tells them in 16:25, I've spoken these things to you in paroimiais. In a lot of translations take that as in figures of speech. But the hour is coming when I will no longer speak to you in paroimiais, but I will tell you parousia, that is, with boldness or clarity about the Father. I think that these two terms, paroimia and parousia, these Greek terms, describe Jesus' speech both pre and post-resurrection, respectively.
So the first one would be pre-resurrection, and the last
Right.
one it was post. And I love the way they sort of sound together, right? I think they're intentionally almost rhyming, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
They begin the same, they end the same. There's a same consonant, so there's kind of a rhyming sense on the inside of the words.
It may be part of the reason why, instead of using parabole as Mark and as the synoptic, John opts for paroimia, which is sort of a synonym for parabole. They do overlap semantically, but they're not exactly the same. But that may be part of the reason why he goes with this. And so, because it makes that really nice sort of sound and tension between Jesus's prior speech with paroimia and the later parousia.
So what is paroimia then? Tell us a little bit about that. What does that word mean? Figures of speech. Unpack that a little bit.
Sure. So Quintilian, who is a Latin orator, but he systematizes a lot of Greek rhetorical study. He defines paroimia as essentially a concise proverbial statement that's meant to be interpreted allegorically.
Not literally. Not literally. Okay.
So you could think, for example, of Jesus's claims like, I am the bread of life. I'm the light of the world. I'm the true vine. These are all very, very tight, compressed statements, but they're packed with meaning, and they're meant to be taken allegorically. Similarly, his statements to Nicodemus that you need to be born of water and pneuma, right? Is that spirit? Well, yes, but it can also mean breath. And so you can sort of understand Nicodemus's confusion when Jesus is saying, hey, you need to be born of water and breath. And it's like, I thought, well, yeah, so do I need to be born again of woman? Is that what I need? Another physical birth? Jesus doesn't really clarify that for him. And so I think paroimia is really a good term to describe Jesus's primary mode of speech throughout the gospel, speaking in these concise, proverbial, allegorical kinds of statements. Parousia, on the other hand, typically refers to boldness or frankness of speech. Now, it's not just the idea of a certain disposition, right? It's not simply that Jesus is saying, well, I'm going to say something to you that is really, I'm going to hit it home, I'm going to be forceful. The point is that it actually connotes clarity and forthrightness, that you are saying what you think. So parousia was the privilege of the Athenian citizen. To speak with parousia in the assembly was to say what you really thought without fear of reprisal, without fear of being attacked for actually sharing what might be in the best interest of the community. And the term continued to be used and recognized as sort of the hallmark of the philosopher who speaks inconvenient truths, right? So I think that the juxtaposition of these terms, the claim that Jesus makes that I have spoken to you up to this point in paroimia, in these figures of speech, or really these kinds of proverbial allegorical statements, But the time is coming when I will speak to you about the Father with parousia, with clarity, with frankness. I think that juxtaposition tells us two things about Jesus's characterization. First, Jesus is admitting that his speech in the gospel is enigmatic. It's not an illusion. It's not something that just reflects our idiocy or the blindness of the Jews in the audience. It is actually, in some sense, the characterization of Jesus by himself. That's how he presents his own speech. Yeah. So Jesus knows that his manner of speech is difficult and frequently metaphorical. And secondly, Jesus claims that he would subsequently speak with parousia, forthrightly, saying what he really means. And that suggests that Jesus has hitherto not spoken forthrightly in the gospel. Yeah. That this time post-resurrection is when he's going to do that. And so I think that really what that highlights to me is that Jesus is speaking in a way that wasn't particularly clear to his audiences at the time, and he did so intentionally. And so you can think of Mark 4, where Mark says Jesus spoke consistently in parables, right? But to his own disciples, he explained everything.
That's a great analogy for that. Exactly. I was thinking that as you were talking about how that passage from Isaiah is sort of echoed in what you're saying here. So, man, this really opens up some things and really invites a lot of deep thought about the words that Jesus is choosing, those paroimia, I should say that word correctly, concise proverbs, allegorically interpreted, that kind of thing. So, interesting.
And I think there's a lot of theological payoff for this, but one in particular that stands out to me is that the notion that Jesus's Jewish audiences are just wicked or blind or whatever else, this very common and sort of popular Christian polemic against Judaism has led now to a number of people saying, yep, John is anti-Jewish. It's an anti-Jewish gospel. And so the way that it has been used by Christians is the way it's meant to be used. But I think that if Jesus is intentionally speaking in a puzzling and confusing manner, then the failure to understand both of his disciples and of his Jewish audiences isn't so much evidence of their moral failing as it is of Jesus's intentional communication strategy in the gospel. In other words, they misunderstand because he meant for there to be a misunderstanding. And so there's this contrast between how Jesus spoke during his earthly ministry and how he speaks to us now and how he spoke to the church after the resurrection. And so there isn't really that basis then for attacking the Jewish people, especially not now, but in regards to their blindness or their moral insufficiency. The issue is really that Jesus was misunderstood because Jesus wanted to be misunderstood at times.
Yeah. I remember those sections where in the Gospels it says that they didn't understand until after he rose again or something. Yeah. There's 2 or 3 episodes where Jesus makes a statement and then they say, well, later on they reflect back and they understand now what he was talking about in those enigmatic statements. Yeah. Doug, thanks for being with us today on Exegetically Speaking.
Thank you so much, Dr. Capes. It was a real privilege.
Thanks to Ian Rosine, Rebecca Larson, and Silvio Vasquez, who helped us produce this podcast. Thanks as well to John Alonzma, our Wheaton-based director, who makes this podcast possible. We're grateful to Phil Keggy for our music. If you want to study biblical languages, then you need to consider Wheaton College. Whether you're an undergraduate or a graduate student, we have amazing programs, a first-rate faculty, and some of the best students in the world. So go to the website, www.wheaton.edu, and look for modern and classical languages. Get started today. If you have questions about this or any of our podcasts, we'd love to hear from you. If you have suggestions or questions about any passage in the Hebrew Bible or Greek New Testament, send us an email and we'll see if we can get one of our experts to weigh in on that for you. Our email is exegetically.speaking@wheaton.edu. That's exegetically.speaking@wheaton.edu. Thanks for listening.